Welcome back to this special edition of NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman. This week, we're talking about getting your cattle through the tough winter after this year's serious drought conditions. And as cattlemen know, there's really nothing more important than proper cattle nutrition. Let's return to our discussion. Dr. Patterson, you know, we've had a lot of media coverage around alternative feed sources. And of course, these range from region to region, but tell us about some of the alternative feeds you hear about people using.
Probably the biggest one is the distillers' dried grains, and maybe the distillers' wet grains as well. Corn gluten feed. You know, we've talked about potatoes, we've talked about orange peel products, things like that, soybean hulls and that. So there's a lot of products, but they're regional in nature. Beet pulp that, you know, can't go because it's wet. It would be a good example. So a lot of these byproducts are pretty regional, and you got to figure out what's available to you. One that I really like, I wish we had it on cows in the Southwest, is rice bran, because it's got so much fat in it, but it's pretty hard to transport products like that.
And you know, you talk about obviously cost being an issue and so forth, but what about safety? I've heard some safety issues. What would you tell folks relative to that with alternative feed sources?
Well, my experience has been primarily in the upper Rockies, and a lot of sulfate in the water, okay, in the drinking water. Well, some of these byproducts can also be high in sulfate. So if you mix the high sulfate that might be in, say, distillers' grains with the high sulfate in the water, you're going to end up with a problem called polio or stargazing. And so be really careful when you're feeding, you know, much more than 3 or 4 pounds of that product, because you might tip those cattle into polio or stargazing. So get not only analysis of your forage, let's get an analysis of a byproduct alternative feed that we're going to feed. Let's see what we've got in there. Are
there any other benefits other than the cost that come along with feeding some of these byproducts?
Oh, I think these byproducts are excellent replacement in there, but just got to be careful with them. I think my co-panelists know a lot more about mold issues, other issues on that, but where we've fed dry products, sulfate has by far been the biggest issue that we've had to deal with.
And you mentioned the word mold. Dr. Tejardis, I was going to ask you that question. What are some of the issues you see relative to mold and aflatoxins?
Yeah, one of the biggest problems this year with going through the drought, and then we had some late rains, is that a lot of aflatoxins ended up on the corn. And some plants, you know, the mills have rejected it. Some of the ethanol, a lot of the ethanol plants will use some of that's got the aflatoxin on there. The challenge is that gets concentrated about 3-fold. And so the distillers' grains can carry some aflatoxin. So not only do you have to worry about your corn, but worry about your distillers' grains, because, you know, to a pregnant cow, over 20 part per billion aflatoxin, you can abort that calf. When she's lactating, of course, she's excreting aflatoxin in her milk, and that can be a real serious challenge to those young calves.
And Carrie, you'd mentioned a little earlier that you do feed quite a few alternative feed products. Why don't you tell folks a little bit about the products that you feed and why you feed them? What are some of the benefits that you see to the various feed ingredients?
Well, we're always trying to satisfy our protein and energy needs as cheap as we can, whether we're growing these cattle or whether we're finishing them. And we fed soy hulls and hominy, and we feed wet distillers, and we feed whatever forage we can get our hands on that's cheapest to work around that. Beet pulp goes in our grower rations. We're feeding some beet tailings. We've been experimenting, and I don't know enough about this yet to see how it's going to go, but we're mixing hydrate lime with corn stalks to try to break the lignin down to increase the value of these corn stalks. We've fed potatoes and onions in the past, although we're not able to do that right now. So, but that's our strategy, and I try to look with the end in mind so we can price some of these ingredients ahead of time or get our hands on them, because that's kind of the ball game today, is get your feed lined up at the same time you do the cattle.
And what would you tell people, I mean, are you working with your nutritionist? What would you tell people relative to how they sit down and pencil through these options?
Well, we've got a good nutritionist we work with, and depending on how the products are moving in price-wise in the market, we just try to put in the rations whatever we think's cheapest.
Sure.
So, yeah, you've got to have a good nutritionist who's creative, which we've got. So.
And one of those feedstuffs, of course, Kent, is corn stalks. Now, what guidance would you give us as we think about how best to use corn stalks and actually make the most out of the corn stalks?
Well, like we talked about earlier, corn stalks are, you know, a good fiber source. You can get some feed into the cattle, but they're really poor protein level. And then if you don't add the protein to it, you can't get the fiber to break down. And like Carrie said, that, you know, they are looking at different alternatives to try to break the lignin down and make it more digestible. Hydrated lime or calcium oxide is one product that, or one reaction that we're looking at. You know, in the past, people have ammoniated wheat straw, corn stalks. That's another option. That actually adds protein as well as breaking down the lignin and makes it more digestible. But the main thing is just trying to get a protein supplement too with it, so that the bacteria is what we're actually feeding is bacteria and the microbes in the rumen, and let them do a lot of their work to help break down that forage.
Now, Kent, we don't have many soybeans around here, but I do hear people even baling up soybean stalks this fall and trying to feed them. Is there a limit to what you can do from a soybean stalk standpoint? Yeah,
the soybean stubble, I mean, that is really poor quality. I mean, that's just a filler. Cattle are only going to eat a certain amount. There's not a lot of energy to it, so you need to add some more energy feeds with that. There was some soybean hay put up. Now that's going to be real dusty, but of course when they baled it up it had leaves, so of course that's a lot higher in protein and more digestible. So make sure you test what you've got and try to design your nutrition program around it, so we're not basically causing a deficiency in the cows or not getting enough protein into them.
Well, so talk to us more about that, specifically for, let's say, cow-calf operations that have located some feedstuffs like corn stalks or soybean stalks or what have you. What else should they be feeding to make sure that they keep these cows on a good nutritional plane and don't get into some of the fetal programming issues that both of you have mentioned?
Well, Dr. Patterson had talked about you know, sulfur, but one of the big things with these poor quality forages also, you know, we can get some mineral imbalances, but phosphorus is a big thing that we talked about earlier. Typically, we've got better quality forages. They have more phosphorus in them, and it's not that critical to supplement a lot of phosphorus. Well, with these poor quality forages that didn't grow very well, they're really low in phosphorus, and that's the last thing we want to do is get deficiencies. It's important for reproduction, for milk production. I mean, if we don't get enough phosphorus, we're going to have more open cows, and you know, if they don't lactate very well, then we're going to hurt our weaning weights in the end game. So that's important, and then a good trace mineral program to go along with it, because we're going to have a lot of imbalances in minerals depending on what kind of, you know, forages we're going to use and where they're coming from.
You know, depending on where our viewers live, Chance, some of them just gotten through weaning, others in the fall calving program are looking on to weaning. What would you tell us relative to the economics of feeding that pair versus weaning early? And talk to us a little bit about how those comparisons work, about the nutritional requirements of that dry cow versus the lactating cow.
Right. That's a great question, and actually really good management tool that producers can use to manage through a drought is the early weaning process. And here's the primary reason why. In a drought, what are you short of? You're short of forage. Well, if you actually calculate what a cow that's lactating consumes and what her calf consumes, a 1,200-pound cow, at least in my part of the world, we're talking about 40 pounds of dry matter per day out of your pasture with that pair. Versus if you wean the calf off, obviously his 10 pounds of contribution to the forage intake is gone, plus the cow requirement now is lower, so she eats less forage. Now we're talking about 24 pounds a day forage dry matter versus the 40 with the pair. So 16 pound a day forage dry matter difference times however many cows you have, times however many days this drought lasts, you can see pretty quick how you can reduce your forage use quite a bit by just early weaning those calves. And a lot of people say, well, you know, am I going to take a hit by selling those early weaned calves? Well, really today, with the market we have, you can strip and ship those calves and still make a good bit of money on an early weaned calf. But by the same token, if you have the resources, you don't want to pull any resources away from your cows, but if you have resources, you can wean those calves, and there's a really attractive feed cost to gain today relative to what that value of that gain is too. So you can make it work by backgrounding those calves too. But the key is getting them off your pasture or off of your hay, your stored forage, so that you have enough to get through the entirety of the drought. So that's why early weaning makes a lot of sense.
We've done programs before with folks that have implemented early weaning. How early would you say in a lot of these early weaning programs, what works?
Right. Most of the time we try to keep them on for at least a couple months. But we've seen situations where we had to take them off in a month just because that's what we had to do. I will tell you that that's a very interesting calf to have to wean, and you need to contact somebody that's had experience with that to make sure that you don't get in a wreck there if you choose to keep and background those calves. But really 2 to 3 months old is kind of where you really can make a huge difference, because when they get 2 to 3 months old, that's when they're starting to contribute to the forage use more so than really light calf. So.
Dr. Patterson, for folks who decide to kind of skinny up on some of the supplement to those cows, what impact does that have on a newborn calf, in your opinion?
Well, I think we could impact the immune function. Some of the really great old work showed that when you cut protein down on these cows, I'm going to cheapen this thing up, that our death rate on those calves, they may be born alive, but we get into an immune breakdown, and I'm thinking of some of the work out of Wyoming, lost 19% of the calves because the cows were deficient in protein during gestation. So weak calf syndrome is what we're talking about.
Gentlemen, these are some really important considerations and really helpful information. We'll continue the discussion right after this.